All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Skirmish Line. Today, we are joined by two very exciting speakers. First, Travis Yates, the author of the book, The Courageous Police Leader. Travis has been a guest on several episodes. You're probably pretty familiar with him. And then I will let our next guest introduce himself and tell a little bit about himself.
Well, my name is Kevin Davis. I am and I think I just astounded Travis with this number, a 38-year veteran of law enforcement. Spent about 8 years with the county sheriff's department, and the last 30 years have been with a large municipal agency. I spent about 27 years as the primary use of force instructor. In the last 3 years or so, I've been in the body-worn camera unit as a detective, where I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of digital video evidence and as well as officer-involved shooting. So I am an author. I've written a book on use of force investigations, and I've written for several different law enforcement publications in the past and online portals, as well as an expert witness in the use of force.
Perfect. And what department did you work with?
Well, I'm still with the City of Akron, Ohio Police Department.
Okay, fantastic. Well, nextly, Travis, I'll kind of turn it over to you to tell a little bit about some of the work that's been done in this field.
Well, first, it's such an honor to be here with you, Jerad, and of course, Kevin Davis. He's a legend in this profession, and I'll often say sort of a humble, quiet legend because, true leadership, you don't have to write books and speak on circuits and be loud and boisterous online. And Kevin has been, I say he's been in the background, but he hasn't really. He's obviously an accomplished author, accomplished speaker, accomplished expert witness. But I love Kevin because he's just so humble and quiet and is such a wealth of knowledge in this era. And it's just an honor to be here with you, Kevin and Jerad. And use of force has obviously been in the spotlight in law enforcement. I hate to say post-Ferguson because that was such a scam. But that's when the media and all of these activists really lost their minds. And unfortunately, law enforcement, we didn't react accordingly. Our leadership just said everything that we were asked of after that legal, justified shooting. We just did, right? And Kevin mentions he's in the body camera of digital video unit, and that's been a blessing for us. I know we'll get into that today. But that ironically, that came out of Ferguson or some of the other high-profile shootings. That vast majority were legal, justified shootings. And I think body cameras are saving our profession. And so oftentimes in our seminars, we talk about the use of force data. I love data because data takes the emotion out of it, Jerad. It takes the anger out of it. It's just data. And you can interpret data certain ways, but when data on its surface paints a picture of how good and professional and accomplished law enforcement is. And that's what the blessing has been from not only the data that is now out there on law enforcement, but also the video camera technology.
And since we're talking about data, I think Kevin has really done some amazing work there. There is an online database that was created by the media because they thought there was going to be an aha moment there. And I think the aha moment belongs to us on this side of the line. Travis, can you lead us in a little bit about what that database is, and we'll kick it over to Kevin for the work he did.
Yeah, and Kevin's really expert on this, but the Washington Post, I believe in 2015, started tracking deadly force in American law enforcement. And I really think, obviously on the heels of Ferguson, as I mentioned earlier, they really thought that they were going to find something. They were going to find the evidence. Now, I want to talk negatively about leadership for a little bit. I know it's going to shock some people. It's heard me talk before, but really law enforcement should have been doing this long before the media started doing it. But we didn't, so we can't really track that historically very accurate. If we could, Jerad, we would find out that we're using less deadly force than any time in our history because of the technology and the training and the resources that we do have. But we don't have that. So we really can go back pretty specifically back to 2015. And it's very alarming what it shows. And you're right, the aha moment was not law enforcement. The aha moment was how good and professional we are, particularly when you look at the sensational headlines of the unarmed people shot by police, and particularly of different races, because the media wants to paint a completely different picture of what we actually see. But ironically enough, it doesn't matter that it paints us in a good light, Jerad. The media is continuing their narrative. In fact, the Washington Post pretty much a couple times a year will put a sensational headline. In fact, the last one I saw, I'm actually just saw it for the most recent book that I'm working on was, police are still shooting unarmed black men. Well, that's all the headline says. Well, of course, on any given year, 2 to 3% of any race is going to be shot unarmed. Doesn't mean not dangerous. Doesn't mean it doesn't fall within Graham v. Connor or legal justified shooting. But they throw that out there. They'll never tell you that almost every year, in fact, last year we shot more unarmed whites, not only by numbers but by percentage. And the year before that, it was really just kind of dead even at 2%. They're never going to tell you that. They're going to obviously sensationalize it with race, sensationalize it with these big, large words like unarmed. And the data is our friend. I'm amazed that as a profession, as our leadership, we have not pointed that out more. But that leans credit to what Kevin has done so well at. So if our leadership won't point it out, we're very blessed to have folks like Kevin Davis to actually do that.
Well, thanks, Travis. I appreciate that. I think it's an indicator of where we've come that I actually wrote my use of force investigations book in 2012. And in the first chapter, I talk about being under the microscope. And that was back in 2012 before Ferguson. And you could see, if you were paying attention to use of force and the social justice warriors, especially in the previous Justice administration, you could tell that that things were headed in a certain direction. And subsequently, it only got worse, despite the facts to the contrary. I mean, we could go into Ferguson and that whole shooting, but in reality, what shooting in the last 100 years has survived some close scrutiny, So, I mean, here we have this whole movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was based on a lie of the hands up, don't shoot, so what I did is, and a lot of people condemn the Washington Post, and I certainly have issues with the way they present some of their data and the way they've modified it since they started doing it. But we have to keep in mind that prior to the Washington Post, making an attempt to collect the data on use of deadly force, we were relying on the FBI's numbers. And the FBI's numbers, if you remember, were somewhere around 400 people that were shot and killed by police. So that hopefully we'll get new data in. The Trump administration is pushed for, all shootings to be recorded in a national database. So hopefully we'll get not only some good numbers, but more information in areas that we can look at and maybe help improve officer safety, which is what this is all about for me. Officer safety, not only, let's be honest, we live in uncertain times in policing, and we have created through this close scrutiny and this unfair examination of use of deadly force, we've created tremendous hesitancy in our officers out there. And I was on Facebook earlier because this case really frosted me. There was a young police officer that was just acquitted in Pennsylvania last week in a shooting where he shot and killed a drug-addled subject who was coming towards him. He'd been jumping on cars, beating on windshields and everything, obvious excited delirium situation. This officer shoots and kills him, and they charge him with murder. He goes on trial, and a buddy of ours, Manny Campbellson, was the defense expert in that case. So kudos to Manny because the state's expert, which was a state investigator, made comments like, you cannot use deadly force preemptively on the stand. That was a quote. And, that's certainly not the case. That's not that's certainly, all force is preemptive in nature, because you don't use force or deadly force for what someone has done. You use deadly force to keep them from doing something else. In this case, seriously injure or kill the officer. And then he made another quote, that the officers should have used other tools like taser or pepper spray prior to shooting. And that's clear, ignorance of Placus versus Drinsky, and that whole preclusion thing. It's simply not. The question is, at the moment you pull the trigger, was it objectively reasonable based on the totality of the circumstances and the officer's reasonable perceptions? That's the standard. And here we are today because of a lot of bad data that's out there. So what I did is I took a look at, and I've done it ever since 2015 numbers, and put that out there in an article on policeone.com, and the viewers here can go to Police One to read that piece. But since then, I've done some other numbers. Now, the FOP And here's what I tell people. I'm a big union guy in law enforcement. Probably wouldn't have my job right now if it weren't for the union, because Travis knows that when you what is it? The nail that sticks out is the one that gets hammered. And my outspokenness in a lot of different issues in terms of officer safety and training and use of force has drawn some attention in a negative light. But I've survived that because of the FOP and some good attorneys. I actually put some money in my account, and I can actually say online that my former chief of police is now convicted of crimes in office. So there you go. But that said, when I started looking at the numbers here, I found that when I went through the numbers on what the Washington Post says is unarmed, I found people that were armed, and also some people that were included that were not even the subjects of intentional use of deadly force. For instance, last year, and I did crunch the numbers on last year, there was a female subject who was shot and killed when officers shot at a dog. The rounds went astray and shot and killed her. Now, that's a tragedy in and of itself, but that's not the intentional application of deadly force on her. So she's included in the database from last year, as are some people that were armed. So the first thing I do is print out, all those cases that of subjects that were, quote, unarmed, and go through them and take a look at them. And just to give you kind of, before we go into some statistics and some hard data, just from last year, you have what we know about husband and wife killed in Houston, officer-involved shooting. The subject, right in the first thing, open fired on narcotics officers. Now, how can you be unarmed and shoot at the cops? And then his wife, after they shot and killed, the police shot and killed the pit bull that was attacking them, the wife went for another officer's shotgun when she was shot and killed. So you can say unarmed, but that's a stretch when you're going for somebody's gun. How about this one from Baltimore? And we want to talk about a mess. It was nice didn't the mayor recently say, hey, thugs in our city, please stop shooting because of the virus? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So this guy was shot and killed by Baltimore officers. He had been shot and paralyzed by Baltimore officers earlier when he exchanged gunfire with them and was threatening that he had a gun when he was shot and killed. So isn't that, that's one of the cases we're talking about there. Or how about this one? Here's a subject, this is from the Seattle Times, where this guy had a toddler in his arm, and he was threatening the 18-month-old, when the police shot and killed him. Well, he may be unarmed, but, he's capable of inflicting death on a toddler, and they include that in their unarmed category. Or how about this one, where in a DUI room, a subject took an officer's gun, and where another officer had to come in and shoot him. Once again, unarmed, I don't think so. So right off the face, when you look at the numbers, and if you just crunch the numbers by what they provide, what the Washington Post provides, you get somewhere above 80%. It can be as high as 85% of all police shootings are good. They're shooting armed people, in most cases, that are shooting back at them. Now, we are at a sad place in society when we are charging officers with murder, and I go to Oklahoma, I go to Nashville, and there was another one that just popped up on my radar where these guys have guns and the officer shoots and kills them and has been charged with murder. So when you start looking at the data, it's just the data clearly vindicates us. It does not make us look bad. It only makes us look good. But here's the amazing thing nowadays, and I'll shut up then and let you guys jump in on this, that we have agencies that refuse to defend themselves. They refuse to put good information out. For instance, body-worn cameras are one of the primary sources we should be putting stuff out there. But you know what they're afraid of? They're afraid of the backlash in the community. The same people that thought that the cameras were going to capture bad behavior don't want officers or don't want agencies to put it out there when it makes members of the public look bad. So I'll shut up and let you guys chime in.
Well, Jerad, let me jump in on that, and we've got to come back to body-worn cameras, but Kevin is exactly right, and I'm glad he pitched Police One. Let me tell everybody, I wrote an article on lawofficer.com. If you go on the search button and type, what does unarmed mean? I pulled these a couple of years ago, nothing to the extent of what Kevin does on an annual basis, which is a great blessing to our profession. But we found things like a man was robbing a bank and said he had a bomb, so the police shot him, but it ended up being a fake bomb. And they called that unarmed. Or how about this one, when a guy has his girlfriend around the neck threatening her, he has a gun, pointing the gun at cops, the police shoot, and, unfortunately killed his girlfriend too. And, of course, that's an unarmed shooting. And Kevin's right, but even take the bad data. It still shows us, as Kevin said, in an excellent light, and it's pretty amazing. But not only are we prosecuting officers for shootings that are legal and justified under Graham v. Connor, reasonable, but we also, the activists are using that to riot and protest. You can look in Charlotte, North Carolina with Officer Brentley Vinson. When that guy had a gun, refused to drop a gun, the African-American officer shot him. The African-American suspect was killed with a gun in his hand. They had DNA evidence of him on the gun right next to him, and it's on video. They still tried to burn the city down, and Charlotte is still under a microscope today from that shooting 3 years ago. It really is amazing, and we're in desperate times because Kevin is right. You have to look long and hard to find one officer doing anything wrong out of the millions and millions of contact every day, all caught on video, either our video or someone else's video. But when they find – so what they have to do now is find things that are legal and legitimate. And Kevin's right. We're not defending ourselves, and we have the best tool to do it with video.
So one of the things I want to interject that I hear from activists all the time, and I'm going to pose this question to each of you individually, is race the largest determination in use of force and application of deadly force? Because that's what we hear from the activists is white officer shoots black suspect, and that race is the predominant deciding force there. So Kevin, I want to pitch that to you first. Does your data show that?
Well, I would refer you guys to Heather McDonald, who's a wicked smart lady, and I got a big crush on her, by the way, because I raised two really wicked smart daughters, and I admire people like Heather who are so spot on an area that's not even her forte, which is law enforcement. But no, that's the big push when you compare. And this is the astounding thing. When you look at who dies from violent crime, in this country, it's primarily young African-American males. But who are the suspects in those homicides? Young African-American males. And if you compare the percentage of those people that commit the crimes and those that die with the ones that are shot by police, as well as those people that are arrested for those crimes, it's virtually identical across the board. So when you actually look at crime statistics, instead of, and I heard this by, I think, Joe Cesario, if people have an opportunity to read some of his writings on the subject. He's been unfortunately lampooned by his liberal peers, but Dr. Cesario has written some really interesting stuff and done some great research. And he says, otherwise, you'd have to believe that police drive down the street and randomly shoot people, as members of the population. When in reality, who they're shooting is who they're dealing with, which are violent criminals in that regard.
So I'll pitch it to Travis. What do you think the biggest indicator of an application of force is, Travis?
Well, first off, let me piggyback on Heather McDonald. I had a chance to interview Heather on one time when her new book, War on Cops, came out. And I got to admit, I listen to that late at night sometimes with my eyes closed, and I enjoy it thoroughly over and over again. But I also do have a crush on Heather. But the crazy thing is, Jerad, is you don't have to take my word for it. Kevin mentions Joseph Cesario. We have multiple scientifically peer-reviewed articles out there that have looked at this, and it is not even an indicator, not even close. And, of course, the only thing that can be said about these researchers, many of them African American, is they're just called racist. They're called this. They're called that. And by the way, that's the first indicator. If no one can argue the facts with you, and they just go to the race card, you know they can't argue the facts with you, and you can't argue with this research. And it's unfortunately we've had some courageous researchers, PhDs, doing that research, and it is clear. In fact, how the activists use race to try to tie it back to shootings is they don't compare it, as Kevin said, to the criminal element. They don't compare it to people committing crimes. They compare it to the general public at large. It's the racial disparity myth, really sort of thrown out there by President Obama in the Cambridge incident, which hard to believe has been 12 years ago, when a Cambridge police officer went to a 911 call for a burglary. He couldn't choose the call. He couldn't choose the color of the house. He couldn't choose the color of the suspect. He literally went to a burglary call, and that incident, one thing led to another. The guy was very defiant, called his mother a name, which nothing goes well after that. And the officer took him to jail for a misdemeanor crime in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the president of the United States attributed that to there's a long history of racial disparity in police stops. Well, first off, there's so many things wrong with that picture. It wasn't a police stop. But so he threw that out there. Of course, we've heard that prior to that, and that has just snowballed. So they yank that research, they yank that data in for general public, and they apply it to everything the police do. Keep in mind, they don't apply it to anybody else. They don't apply it to the NBA or Major League Baseball or Disneyland or the healthcare system or the banking world. They only apply it to us because the truth is the disparity is in every aspect of American life, one way or the other. That's just the way it is. We don't live in a perfect world, and that's not for the cops to solve. So, but Kevin's right. When you compare it to, and by the way, University of Cincinnati just came out with the first study that I've seen that has really looked at this disparity issue in law enforcement. I wrote a book a couple years ago, actually 1 year ago, and we have a section on racial disparity, and we couldn't find the scientific research, so we just. Well, I won't say we made it up, but we just used common sense and compared officer force to the criminal element. Of course, we found what Kevin said is there is no disparity whatsoever. But we told police departments, this is how you need to compare it. You need to put this out there. Of course, very few listen to us. But now we actually, if you go to University of Cincinnati, in fact, if you type in Tulsa Police Department, University of Cincinnati, just a couple of weeks ago, they came out with a study, and the lead researcher, of course, the study was on the heels of the city of Tulsa doing the exact same thing with Tulsa Police Department, taking the general population, applying it to police use of force. And of course, the number was out of whack. She called doing that junk science. This is a accomplished researcher that said anyone that would have the audacity to do that is nothing more than using junk science to come to conclusions. She said any real researcher would compare it to exactly what Kevin said. You would compare it to the criminal element. And when she did that in Tulsa, and I am very confident because I've been to a lot of departments, that if any department would compare it the accurate way, what she found was there was literally no indication of race being a factor in force. In fact, what she found in Tulsa was young black males were underrepresented when you look at the data. Now, of course, nobody's covering that story. No one's going to talk about it. So it's on police leaders to talk about it. But if all departments need to start looking at that. And it's so apparent. I'll just speak for my agency. Out of all the encounters that we have with the public on use of force over a 30-month period, we used force 1.7% of the time against whites, 1.8% of the time against blacks, and Asians really have an argument, 2.2%. Within 0.5% of all races. But the activists are still banging the drum because that's all they have is compared to the general population. So law enforcement has not done a good job of defending ourselves, like Kevin said. And if you want to see law enforcement actually enforcing the law and being police officers and making communities safer, you better start defending yourselves, because there are departments in this country that have been completely destroyed. I won't mention any names: Baltimore, Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, because they refuse to defend themselves, and they're listening to people that don't want to see law and order in their communities.
Well, look at Cleveland in that regard too. I mean, Cleveland, what did they see? The DOJ came in, the big scrutiny in terms of use of force. So what has violent crime done in Cleveland? Spiked, and Heather did an excellent thing for that Prager University. You can access that video on YouTube, which is really interesting, because once again, when you hit people with the hard numbers, when you hit them with the data, that's what's so one-sided. And Travis, you talked about the former DOJ and the former administration. But keep in mind that the same people, that's Vanita Gupta, who was the head of the Civil Rights Division under the Obama administration, Justice Department, and her number two, which was, I'll think of her name here in a minute, Christy Lopez, I think it was. Anyhow, they were both so pro body camera. They were pushing that really big, but once the body cameras came in and they started vindicating officers and showing the realities of the encounter, then all of a sudden they were saying, hey, these body cameras violate the Fourth Amendment rights of average citizens. So it's astounding how the worm has turned in that regard. So
I agree with everything that was just said. I did want to point out one of the things out of the study from Dr. Ingalls in University of Cincinnati that Travis pointed out, and this was kind of where I was going with my original question. In her study, she said the largest indicator for use of force was subject action. So essentially what her research is pointing to is it doesn't matter what gender you are, it doesn't matter your age group, and it doesn't matter your race or religion. It is your actions that drive the action of the officer. If you're resisting arrest, if you're committing a crime, if you're not following directions, those are the things that are the largest indicator to use of force and use of deadly force. Do you gentlemen both agree that statement, just in common sense alone, would hold true?
Common sense is not that common anymore, isn't that a dictum nowadays? Yes, I would absolutely say. Not only that, we have multiple studies, like Travis mentioned. You had Joseph Cesario, and by the way, in Congress, you had somebody that claimed that Cesario had violated some statistical stuff, and he made some false statements under oath in Congress. And then, unfortunately, Heather McDonald spoke before he did, and then she was chomping at the bit to jump on it, but nobody asked her a follow-up question because he just flagrantly disregarded the truth in that. But you have Cesario, you have Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist who published his data. There's multiple studies now that clearly show the same thing.
Travis?
Listen, Jerad, and something to mention about Fryer especially, and even what Kevin said about Cesario, just like they do to folks like you and Kevin, they go after you to try to silence you, right? They can't stand the facts being out there, so they attack you. They threaten your job, and if you work for cowards, they could get your job. Or if you don't have a union representative representing you, they went after the Harvard professor so much, he ended up on, I believe it was a 2-year suspension, because what they do is they just go up, they just pick your life apart, right? And then they found something that was not even had anything to do with his study, found something else on him, and he ended up, I believe, without a job for a couple of years. I think he's still kind of in the penalty box, and there's one other profession that happens, and it's in law enforcement. So what that does, though, is it discourages anybody else to actually study this issue, because that is the most dangerous thing that can happen to these so-called social justice warriors, keyboard cowards, is, man, we can't have the facts out there because that takes our agenda away.
I want to cover more of that right after the break. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back with you. One of the topics we're going to cover is how to stop these cowards going forward. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us after our commercial break. We've got lots more to cover in a short amount of time, so we're going to get right into it. Travis, tell us a little bit about how things are changing and how we can fight back.
Well, I cannot stress enough, Jerad. I said this before 2020 started, and we have seen a ton of stories based on this. The people that really had a chokehold on law enforcement in the Obama years, because no one was combating this, and anybody that did was just absolutely destroyed by the media. They are very desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. And so the stories are going to get more outrageous. Shooting people pointing guns at you will not be considered justified. There'll be questions no matter what. And God forbid you shoot somebody trying to run you over with a car, which is obviously often very justified, and when it happens somewhat. So it's going to be a very desperate moment for people. So law enforcement cannot sit on the sidelines anymore. And one thing that troubles me, and we see this almost everywhere, and Kevin mentioned it earlier, is we have the greatest tool ever to combat this. Not only is the data a great tool, but we have body camera technology. But what does law enforcement typically do with body camera technology? Well, we hold on to it. We don't say anything about it. And then we wait for open records request, and typically the open records request is always for use of force, even though that's a small minority of the police actions. In Tulsa, it's 1.7, but that's probably similar around the country, even less than that some places. And we wait for the ORAs to come in, and then we give the body camera footage to the media, or nowadays any particular person that wants it. We let them put the body camera footage out. We let them talk about it. We sometimes even let them edit it, and then we don't even say anything. And then sometimes the department will when they put it out, they'll talk about it. But think about it just in general complaints. We wait for a complaint or a lie on Facebook, and then we release the body camera footage. If there's an officer involved in an encounter, and they know that someone's off far away filming them or whatever it is, and they know they know that probably there's going to be a viral Facebook message that goes on out there. Why are we waiting for that Facebook message to go viral before we respond? By the way, most departments don't even respond, which is even a shame. You don't even deserve to be a leader of a police department if you don't respond to that. But why are we waiting for the viral Facebook message to respond when we have all the tools to put it out there before anybody? And you don't see hardly anyone doing that. And it's really a shame. And I got to give Kevin credit. They had a shooting in his city, and he put together a package, a video that is absolutely outstanding, where they talk about what happened. They talk about the narrative. They talk about the context. They slow down the video. They show the weapons, everything that was going on. And Kevin, I don't know the story behind that, but I have a feeling you probably your department waited to put that out until the controversy occurred. What I'm trying to say, I've been saying it until my life may be short, and I've been saying this so much, Jerad. Why are we holding on to this footage? Put it out. Put the footage out before the controversy, because then the first story is typically the story that sells. If you don't believe me, just think about Hands Up, Don't Shoot, which unfortunately a wide amount of the general public believes that to this day, because we waited so long to talk about that. It should be our story first, because our story is the truth, and we know exactly what happened, but you're not seeing very many people do that.
That's correct,
Well,
Kevin.
that's a pretty deep subject to dive into, and I agree with every single thing that Travis said. And a couple of things there. I've been pushing for a number of years to put these shootings out, especially when they're captured on video. And this actually predates body-worn cameras. And I can tell you a story about an officer-involved shooting we had where one of the subjects pled out. Two I think they were brothers, were shot by an officer, not killed, but shot and wounded. Happened in the downtown area. One of the subjects had a gun. The video was actually, law enforcement agencies think they're not going to have to deal with digital video evidence, when in reality, whether you have BWC programs or not, every place is running surveillance systems, from blink systems to ring doorbells to surveillance in markets and churches and everywhere else. They all have some type of surveillance cameras. And so, and I had the opportunity to talk to present a class with Laura Scary, kind of an impromptu thing that I led last year, about some of this and how we need to ramp it up. But, and the problem with that is what you see is not necessarily the reality of things oftentimes, especially if you have variable frame rates, you have poor quality video with time in between the images that may not capture the officer's actual movements or the suspect's threatening movements. For instance, depending on the speed of the frame rate on a camera, it may even miss most of a draw stroke from concealment of a suspect when they're drawing and presenting a gun. So in this particular case, it was captured on a surveillance camera, and the primary investigator wanted me to come in and testify at trial of this kid. I went and had a meeting with this guy. The prosecutor was 15 minutes late. He looked like a bag of rags, and he walked into his office and turned his back to me and got on his computer terminal. And I just started talking. I said, well, here's some of the things that I can do for you. And essentially he goes, well, we're not going to use you as an expert, which since then I've testified in multiple cases for this prosecutor's office as an expert, because they understand the importance of somebody coming in and talking about the dynamics of armed encounters, even if it's a civilian a bad guy shooting a bad guy, that type of thing, to ensure that they get a conviction. But anyhow, this guy says, well, we're not going to use you as an expert. And I said, okay. So I sat out in the hallway outside of the courtroom for about a day and a half, and they never did call me, and the subject ended up being acquitted, which was amazing. Subsequent to that, they used the video against the police department, put it out there, but it didn't show context. It didn't show the realities of things, but they used it effectively. And and I think Travis alluded to this, if we're not going to use these things to defend our officers, they're going to be used to create, used as contextual things for the subjects who are against the police, be it in civil trials or whatever else. So in this particular case, I got so ticked off about this thing that I went home over the weekend and using some, at that time, very amateur software that I had to create context, to slow it down, to do still images and circles of what actually transpired. And I went to the FOP on Monday and I said, listen, the department won't put this out there to defend our guy, but we should do it. And at that time, our FOP president elected not to do it. But now that piece of evidence that I created, we're in a civil trial, is being used to defend the city at the civil trial. You're going to have to get on board with this stuff at some point. Why not do it? One of the best things you can do is ensure conviction of a subject who assaults a police officer, or shoots at a police officer. One of the best things you can do. So why are we so reluctant? We don't even use BWC footage to put it out there for training of our own officers. I'm mystified at the millions we're spending at this stuff, and yet we don't look at data and put it out there to defend ourselves. And now we have concrete proof that we're doing the right thing, and we're not putting it out there. And it is lack of courage. It is lack of courage.
Jerad, can I piggyback on that? There's one reason why
Go ahead.
Many agencies aren't doing it. Cancel culture. No one's got a problem in law enforcement to run down a dark alley with a bad guy with a gun. But we're scared to death of somebody online saying something negative about us, or worse yet, calling you a racist, which it's been very effective. And so these agencies, and I've talked to these chiefs. I've talked to a former chief of mine who was scared to death to do any of this because it may offend either the criminal element or the social justice warriors that could care less about effective law enforcement. And it blows my mind, and it's destroying good cops and good agencies.
Absolutely.
No, that's exactly, and if I may just jump in here real quick, is in that video that Travis talked about that we finally put out that was of an unarmed subject who, for whatever reason, spun towards officer and brought his hands from a classic low ready position up to what we'd call a weaver stance and pointed at, his hands at the officers in dim light. Even we put it out there because we were, like Travis said, we were getting beaten up about it. But what happened then is I just had a boss come in and say, we got absolutely no backlash from doing that. And that is the whole point. That's what we have to do.
Well, Kevin, I wanted to jump in real quick. So in Tulsa, I was the guy on the ground that kind of took the point to decide to fight against the narrative in the Betty Shelby shooting, the Betty Shelby, Terrence Crutcher deal. And I actually got a lot of help from your state. And I really wanted to say thank you for that, between Mark Weaver, who's a assistant special prosecutor for the Attorney General's office there, that came down and helped us, but also your former state president, Jay McDonald, and your current state FOP president, Gary. They were all on board. They were all helping us down here. And one of the biggest things that opened my eyes really quickly is that what you see in the initial video is not always accurate. So in the Betty Shelby shooting, we had body-worn camera video, we had dash camera video, and we had helicopter video. And all of those had a very high compression rate on that video, and it had predictive video frames in it. And when you would watch it, you would slow it down, but you didn't enhance it. You didn't go in and pull the predictive frames out. You didn't do all that stuff. You would see Mr. Crutcher walking away with his hands up. He would walk up beside his vehicle. He'd turn sideways, and he would kind of start to slump forward, and then you would see him, jolt and go to the ground. And that's the video that was released by the agency that I work for. For better, for worse, that's the decision that they made, and they didn't put any context with it. And everything that I'm saying here, I'm expressing as my own personal feelings. I'm not speaking on behalf of my agency, but I can speak from the FOP's point of view. The thing that was revolutionary for us, and I sat in that trial every single day, is had they waited one day longer to release that video, the enhanced video would have been ready. It was ready less than 24 hours after when they held their press conference. And that video showed a completely different story. I mean, it was shocking to me, somebody who had watched that original video footage that was released to the media, not hundreds, but I would estimate probably thousands of times that I watched that from beginning to end, dissecting it, trying to figure out what was going on with my officer. And when I saw the actual legitimate video that had all these doodads pulled out of it, when they played it in the courtroom, the entire jury gasped, because they had seen the video that was released to the media. And when they watched that other video, you saw Mr. Crutcher go all the way in up to his shoulder, reaching in the window to retrieve something, and was only shot when he was pulling his arm back out. And that made all the difference in the world for the ladies and gentlemen of that jury. And it made that entire case make sense to everyone. And it's just amazing to me why we allow, as a profession, these predictive frames to stay in there. I would rather watch herky-jerky video that's not smooth, but it's telling me the truth, versus something that's been slicked up by a computer algorithm that may not be accurate. Because these use of force decisions, they happen in tenths of seconds, not in seconds. And this video doing predictive frames just absolutely does us all a disservice. Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's spot on, and I'm going to even go further here, that agencies were quick when pushed to adopt BWC programs with no knowledge as to how they were going to deal with that digital video evidence. And what I mean by that is it takes somebody that not only has knowledge about digital video evidence, but also somebody that has knowledge about human movement, about firearms encounters, about violent encounters in general, to analyze that video. And when I went into the BWC program, I was actually pushed out of the training bureau. They wanted some new blood in there. So, us old guys that didn't know anything got pushed out. But when I landed in BWC, I recognized the coming tide with this video. And so I went about educating myself, because I was actually turned down on multiple courses on how to deal with digital video evidence. And so I went and I educated myself. And I remember the chief at one point said, you're not going to be doing video analysis of use of force incidents. And let's just say that I worked on every single officer involved shooting since we got the BWCs. And it was kind of funny in the last shooting that we had, because we brought in some excellent forensic software called Input Ace, and I deal with Premiere Pro, Adobe Premiere Pro, and all that. When we had this shooting, I got a call, hey, can we come down to your office? And I said, sure, come on down. And so I was in the kitchen washing my lunch dishes when, I walked back out, and there was the mayor, the deputy mayor or safety director, the mayor's chief of staff, the mayor's press person, the chief of police, and two majors, and our PIO, all in my little office. And for the next hour, I broke down that video for them of why that was a good shooting. I appreciate that fact, by the way. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the fact that I was able to help those officers. And that's it. And Travis knows me well enough to know that that's what I'm about, And so I applaud their decision to allow me to do that and allow me to create that video. But you're spot on. There are so many things. See, here's the problem with use of force investigations in general. And the reason that I wrote my book to begin with is that friends of mine were involved in shootings and were treated like criminal suspects. You know, I had to argue with an old homicide detective sergeant who said that the officer was the suspect in a homicide. And I said, no, he's the victim of an attempted murder, you know, or felonious assault. And that's a huge paradigm shift when you start looking at the officer as the victim of a crime or a potential victim of a crime. You treat them differently. And the book, my emphasis was to professionalize this whole process. And I still am flummoxed by the lack of professionalism. You know, I worked on a case in Pennsylvania where a young part-time school resource officer was charged with murder and did 4 years in jail before he pled out on involuntary manslaughter just to get out of jail because in a perfectly good shooting. And in the investigation, they brought up stuff like, you know, the state curriculum on use of force and other things that had nothing to do. They did a classic Placus versus Drinsky that he should have, this was an off-duty shooting. When he went in to get his gun, he should have got his whole duty belt. And what difference does that make whether the shooting was good or not? So here's what the sad state we're in law enforcement right now. We desperately need those courageous leaders that Travis talks about, but we need professionals that know use of force. And I don't think it's a stretch to say the majority of high-level supervision in most agencies don't know use of force. They don't know Graham. They don't know, you know, how to conduct solid investigations. And it's my nightmare that, you know, that I've seen so many officers have to go through these things unnecessarily.
Well, let me pitch it over to Travis for just a second. Travis, I would like to hear a follow-up from you on that. But secondly, let's transition a little bit and talk about our brothers and sisters out in California and how the misapplication of a good shooting can turn into a negative thing for all of us.
Yeah, let me piggyback on what you said about the Shelby case, and I will say that my comments will not relate to the Shelby case, but things in general, because as you know, Gerald, you mentioned Shelby and Tulsa, and people's heads start spinning around like The Exorcist. But I want to make my comments in general and not on that case, and also my comments are based on me not representing the police department, but as an individual civilian and police officer with 27 years experience. But I'll tell you one reason why departments are not getting the video right. More or less context, but using wrong video to put out to the public, where they, in the case you said, they could have waited 24 hours and put out the correct video that ends up being shown in court anyway. One reason alone. These cowards want to destroy a law enforcement officer over criminals or activists don't know what they're doing. They would rather destroy someone that's dedicated their life to a community that they know for a fact was a legal, justified shooting, but they would rather destroy them to give the evil ones, so to speak, what they want, which is carnage. And we've got that carnage dropping all over our agencies, all over our country. And it has to change. It just has to change because desperate people are going to be doing more desperate things. And I don't see enough push to make that change. And Kevin talks about the lack of knowledge on Graham v. Connor, and I go through Graham v. Connor. And I'm in rooms oftentimes with high-level executives. People have been in law enforcement for 10, 15, 30 years. They don't know Graham v. Connor. And when I go through Graham v. Connor, the look in their face, because they're listening to crazy people and not reading what the Supreme Court says. And I want you to, maybe we can piggyback to this, Jerad, but I'd love to get Kevin's thoughts on how sound Graham v. Connor is, because Graham v. Connor is attacked all the time. It's not even close. One of the last two cases that I know of that attacked Graham v. Connor to try to get it more like the California incredible nonsense that's going on there, because California is literally violating Graham v. Connor. One case was a 8-0 case after Scalia had died. The other case was a 7-2 case. And so it's even with the court that is very divided, even those liberal judges on the Supreme Court recognize the importance of Graham v. Connor. So it's going to be around a very long time, long past our careers, long past the next generation of law enforcement. So it's amazing to me that we are not using that correctly. And when you talk about California, obviously that came out of Sacramento, legal justified shooting. Kevin mentioned a shooting in his area where a suspect had done a Weaver stance, pointed an object or pointed at officers like they're shooting. By the way, I don't know whether it's just my imagination, but I see this far too often. I don't know whether this is happening more now or less now. Kevin may have an answer on that, but I fear that the suspects are actually absorbing the media and this unarmed stuff, and they think to themselves, hey, I can't win the lottery. The odds are against me, but if I can get shot unarmed, I'm somehow a victim of this. I can somehow, because we're seeing this a lot. And of course, that case in Sacramento, it was a car burglary suspect. Multiple neighbors had called in. Police show up, suspect runs. Once again, suspect's actions are what indicates these shootings. The police get him in the backyard. Actually, of course, after the fact, we found out it was his grandpa. What the heck was going on? And I wouldn't open the door for the guy either. But they bring that information after the fact and try to blame law enforcement. And it doesn't matter if he was at his grandma's house. It doesn't matter if he was at the door of the White House. His actions dictated that shooting. And he, of course, turned a cell phone at the officers in the shooting stance. They shoot him. One of the officers that happened to be African-American. None of this seems to matter. It's always about race, right? And of course, the entire state lost their mind. Riots, they're blocking interstate games, which good luck doing that today. What's going on right now. And the state legislature actually took Graham v. Connor and just gutted it. And I've talked to hundreds of California cops. I was just out there a few months ago. They're scared to death. Don't think that's not coming to a state near you, because everybody is copying West Coast, East Coast. It comes to the middle of the country, and they can't change Graham v. Connor. They can't change the federal standard, Jerad, but they will change local standards. They will change state standards. And the community will suffer, because law enforcement will have no choice but to just not go after suspects, because when you go after suspects, their actions sometimes dictate force. And so officers' only choice in that matter is, when they're looking at being prosecuted for a legal justified shooting, is, hey, I'm not going to go after any of these. He's not going to go to jail for it. And so you're going to see the results of that in California. In fact, you already are in many cities. If you don't believe me, just look at the violence that's going on in the major cities in California today.
Well, just to jump on that, one of our Ilita brothers, Dave Blake, did the expert work on that shooting, on the Stephon Clark shooting. And, the viewers here can just Google that. And that report is available online to see some of the work that he did, which was really sound. And by the way, your investigator out in Tulsa, I had a chance to listen to the debrief on your shooting, and did really good work on that as well. But just to kind of jump in on that with California, Shirley Weber is an assemblywoman in California, and she was the main push of something called AB, or Assembly Bill 392. And one of the things she was quoted as saying is that in 2017, officers killed 172 people in California. Most of those were unarmed. All right, think about that, 172, and most of them were unarmed. Oh, by the way, last year, out of the 970 suspects that were killed by police in 2019, we had 41 unarmed. So, okay, on the face of it, it's bizarre. But the truth of the matter is that according to those Washington Post numbers, 162 in California were shot and killed. Only 11 of those subjects were unarmed. One was white, 2 blacks, and 8 Hispanics were killed. One Hispanic, and this was a kid, was accidentally killed by officers, once again, when they were shooting at a pit bull. Missed him, hit the round ricocheted and hit this kid and killed him. Sad, but once again, not intentional use of deadly force. One male was shot at the Los Angeles airport when he assumed a shooting stance and pointed a paper sack at officers at a security checkpoint. And I think, Travis, you're onto something when you talk about that suicide by cop or police-assisted suicide. I think whether the person is troubled, looking to win the lottery, or just keep the police away, they do engage in stupid behavior. And if you do stupid things, you win stupid prizes. So that's true. and that 9 of those 11 were committing felonies at the time of the shooting, or wanted for felony crimes including murder, carjacking, and armed robbery. At least 2 of those 11 were gang members wanted for violent felonies. 2 were actively reaching for their waistbands, and at least 3 subjects actively drove towards officers. So on the face of it, this whole thing that Shirley Weber put out, and some friends out in California say they caught her in multiple lies about this thing. I'll defer to other people that actually had that information, but I know in this case she was way off base. And unfortunately, we had a former Los Angeles Police Department sergeant by the name of Cheryl Dorsey, who was a real bomb thrower, and she said some stuff. This is a quote from Cheryl: "We're trained professionals. You don't get to take a life based on something that you think. You need to know, and if you're not sure, and if you don't want to do this job because you're going to be held accountable, those are the people who should not do this job." When police, here's another quote of the Clark case: "When officers use deadly force when someone is not compliant, it's not about gaining control, it's about punishment. And those officers fired an excessive amount of rounds at Stephon Clark. They basically emptied their magazines. This was about punishment, clear and simple." So, I mean, this is the misinformation from these social justice warriors that's out there. You had one who's a law professor from South Carolina go all the way to California and got involved in that because he's pushing, like Travis said, they're looking to change state law, make it more restrictive than Graham, and they're looking to restrict agency policy. And you have a real problem, even though officers, the policy does not bind like law. You have a real problem when you have a policy that differs from Graham, because you set the stage where you have a perfectly lawful shooting, but the officer has violated policy. And that is not going to play well for the agency in civil court. It's going to be used against it.
So let me jump in on that. Something that I'm doing here in Oklahoma and I'm part of, one of our local attorneys based out of Oklahoma City by the name of Gary James, that represents a lot of highway patrol troopers in Oklahoma and Texas in officer-involved shootings. We're getting a law change at the Capitol, and until COVID-19 came in and put our entire state Senate in quarantine, we've got a bill that was passed by the House and moved on to the Senate in the state of Oklahoma that says that policy violations are forbidden from being brought into state court cases. So they can't bring it in on the state murder charge if they charge your officer with murder in criminal court, and it can't be brought in state civil court. Now, we can't prevent it in federal court, but we can prevent it in state court. And I would urge any union members that are watching this to bring this up to their unions across America, because that is something that I've seen, even in these criminal cases, is prosecutors walk in front of a jury and say, well, you may hear that this is a justified shooting, but his department or her department found this out of policy. This person was disciplined for being out of policy. Well, in one of those highway patrol shootings, the thing that was out of policy about it wasn't the shooting itself. It was the pursuit that precipitated before the foot pursuit that was before the officer-involved shooting. He didn't wear his seat belt, and there was too many people in the pursuit, and they found that out of policy, and the prosecutor was trying to
like that never happened before.
Right. But that has nothing to do with the officer-involved shooting.
Oh, you're spot on.
Right. And the fact that those get brought into those court cases is despicable. I mean, we wouldn't allow that kind of tactic to be used against a citizen. We can't allow that kind of tactic to be used against our officers.
No, I'm so frustrated with this whole thing, because when an officer violates policy, what can happen to them? All right. They can be disciplined right up to and including termination. When an agency violates their policy, what happens to them?
Nothing.
Not a damn thing. Not a damn thing. In that case I talked about, referred to in Pennsylvania, where that part-time SRO officer served 4 years in a shooting case, the chief of police told the state investigators that they didn't have a officer-involved policy and procedure. And it wasn't true. They did. As a matter of fact, in that policy and procedure, it even has an attorney's name and phone number and says that that officer will not give a statement until that attorney's called. And if the attorney makes the decision that that the shooting was illegal or whatever, that they will still represent them up until the time, of the criminal case. So what happened in that case? The DA made a motion and was successful from excluding that evidence in the trial because this officer, a part-time officer, was not a member, was not a bargaining unit member. So it was like the policy did not apply to a part-timer. And you're going, who makes this, excuse the vernacular, who makes this shit up? And it's so frustrating,
Well, let me piggyback off that. I'll tell you the thing that's frustrating to me, and it's frustrating to one of our guests here, is when you actually do stand up and you push back and you're not breaking the media policies, you're not breaking the rules, and they just keep moving you till they run out of places to put you.
Kevin's never been a victim of that.
Yes. And I will say that about Travis. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Kevin, but he used the phrase "war on police," and he used it 24 hours before it was used in a nationwide, published by the Associated Press article in a headline, and he said it in a community meeting. And you would have thought that he shot somebody. I mean,
well, I said to be clarified, to give context, I said it 5 days after 7 Dallas area officers were murdered, and I think 3 Louisiana officers were ambushed and murdered. But let's not let context get in the way of a good story, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
it's unfortunate.
Shortly after that, Travis was relocated from where he was at somewhere else.
Well, and that's a good point, Jerad, because that's once again, just like these keyboard warriors will attack you with no evidence whatsoever to try to silence other people. You get administrators that can't punish you because you haven't violated policy. They can't discipline you, but they can do things to you to make you feel uncomfortable, to tell everybody else, keep your mouth shut. And I know for a fact, Kevin probably doesn't want to get into it, but he has suffered the same thing. And we've got officers all over the country that have suffered the same thing, but it has worked because very few people are speaking on these issues, even though they're completely true and accurate.
That's right. Well, I'll leave you with, or tell this short story. I worked for the Fraternal Order of Police in Ohio, defending a deputy who was charged with misdemeanor crimes and a perfectly good use of force. Terrible investigation, botched investigation. So we got him acquitted of the charges. And my agency had leased range space from the county at their training facility. And they banned me for a month and a half. And said I couldn't step foot on the property. And I go, wait a second, isn't this like, a public, property, and don't we lease space and everything? So that's one of the fallouts. But I had a deputy chief, who, by the way, was the shortest serving mayor in our city because he fondled a woman, got kicked out of office or left office within a week. But anyhow, this was after that. But he came to me and he said, we're really disappointed that you testified against us. And I said, last time I checked, you weren't on trial for anything. He was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he is entitled by our jurisprudence to a vigorous defense, And he went, and it went on. And I said, listen, I can look at myself in the mirror when I'm shaving. How about you? I'll take my lumps. It's been an interesting career. It's coming to a close here. I'm excited about the future, but if we just did the right thing by our officers, just like with this topic on use of force, just did the right thing. And when they do the right thing, under the worst set of circumstances, when they do the right thing, we need to back them up. If we just did that, we'd all be better off. But politics, and I call it the politics of force, and I've written pretty extensively about it, when it enters in, it's just so sad because the facts and the truth don't matter. They get pushed off to the side.
I absolutely think that is a great note to close us out on. We could all talk about this for many more hours, but I think we're kind of at the end of our time period here. Travis, tell our viewers how they can learn more about you and your book.
First off, Jerad, it's an honor to be here. And Kevin, what an honor to have you here. And thank you so much for the service you've done in our profession. And it's pretty easy to find me. You can go to stopcowards.com. Stopping cowards has become my lifelong mission. I will never stop speaking out about cowards that are hurting our professions and hurting other professions, by the way. So just go to stop podcasts like this one and other ones, and I do a weekly radio show. You can find that one as well, along with links to my first book and then my second book that will be out here in about 6 weeks.
I look forward to the new book, by the way. You know?
I think we all are.
Well, give Kevin's book. Kevin, be sure to give a plug to your book because it's outstanding.
Well, yes. Thank you.
Kevin, how can we find out more about you?
Well, I do have a website. It's called KD. That's the initials. Kevin Davis or KD hyphen or dash forcetraining.com. That's KD-forcetraining.com. People, I do respond well to email. That's probably the best way. Trainer Kevin Davis at gmail.com. There's no hyphens or periods at gmail.com. And you can pick up the book. It's up here on the shelf wherever fine books are sold, but it's available on Amazon. We even lowered the price to $9.95. And I will tell you that volume 2 of the series of books this year. So I'm excited about that. Things to write about.
Kevin, can you give the name of your book one more time? I think we had a little bit of internet problem.
Sure. It's Use of Force Investigations, a Manual for Law Enforcement.
Perfect. And I'll put that in the show notes for anybody that's watching. You'll be able to click on that. It'll take you straight to Amazon to buy both of these gentlemen's books. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us here on the Skirmish Line. It was an absolute honor to have both of you, and thank you for all the tireless work you do in this field protecting law enforcement officers.
Thank you, Jerad.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Skirmish Line. Have a great day.